Jumping back into the action now, quickly here on the GSMC Chip Shot Football Podcast, I thought it would be a good idea to look at some of the teams that I have been most surprised with already through the first 2 weeks. Which 2-0 teams have been the most surprising thus far to me? There's a couple of teams here that I could have chosen from, but I decided to limit it down to the top 5 most surprising teams, the teams that have impressed me the most at this point of the season. Before I get into number 5 and work my way up to number 1, I wanted to mention some honorable mentions here. One of them being the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think a lot of change, a lot of good defensive play, but so far through the first 2 weeks, I think being 2-0 has a lot to do with their schedule. Not everybody has the benefit of playing the Broncos with a rookie quarterback thus far yet. They're a decent opponent, but I think there are definitely other teams on here that have had better, more impressive wins. So with that being the case now, the other honorable mention I also wanted to mention was the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, because again, their schedule has one impressive win on it, right? Obviously the win this past week against the Lions, but overall, the first week against the Commanders, I feel like could have been a different, opponent, could have led to a different result. So with that being the case, those two are my two honorable mentions. And now with that out of the way, we can get into the top 5. And starting off with the 5th team on my list, the team that has been impressive but not number 1, obviously, to me has to be the Seattle Seahawks, because I've been impressed thus far with both sides of the ball and different aspects of their team offensively specifically, because with a new head coach, with the Seahawks being relatively average over the last 2 years, being 9-8 and not really getting that much better. This was a tricky situation, I think, for new head coach Mike Macdonald to come into and really make an impact right off the bat. But that's exactly what he's done so far, right? Because they got here with a win over Denver and New England as their two opponents, and not the most impressive wins, but I think where the Steelers are compared to Seahawks and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, I think those two teams, the Steelers and the Bucs, are better teams overall, whereas the Seahawks, I think, are closer to the Broncos and the Patriots. So that's why I had to include them on my list. They showed a great running game, like I mentioned before. One aspect of their offense that I didn't expect to be that dominant right off the bat. It was very dominant. It was the reason why they won in week 1 after a great performance by Kenneth Walker, that offensive line as well. They ran all over the Broncos and beat them 26-20, if I'm not mistaken. And then this past week, it was another great performance offensively, but from the passing side of that offense, right? Geno Smith played very well in this game. I think he had over 300 yards or something like that passing. DK Metcalf had a big game. Jackson Smith and Jigba had another big game as well to complement each other. So that was right off of the bat what I noticed just through those first 2 games, right? They were able to beat teams with the run and beat teams with the pass. And from that point on, now getting an overtime win, I think, is huge for this team, to continue being 2-0, especially in that division, right? Because you look at the teams that they're dealing with overall, and you look at the 49ers, who were upset a little bit, I guess you could say, against the Vikings. That's one thing. And then, the Cardinals looking very impressive. They arguably could have been on here, but they're not 2-0 because they lost to the Bills. And, elsewhere, the Rams are surprising because they're 0-2. So this is a great opportunity for the Seahawks to continue this on. Their next game coming up after this is with the Miami Dolphins, and then they travel to Detroit to play the Lions. So those will be good matchups. I know the Dolphins don't have Tua, but once they get to that Lions game, it'll be a good litmus test to see where they're at right now. Then that is only the number 5 team. The number 4 team on this list for me had to be the Los Angeles Chargers. We touched on them briefly in that last segment with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Their capability to adapt to this new idea that Jim Harbaugh is bringing in has really been impressive to me, because it seemed so seamless, right? From the start, from week 1, they ran all over the Las Vegas Raiders, J.K. Dobbins having a monster day at that. And then in the second game, again, not everybody has the luck, the fortune, you could say, of playing the Panthers and I guess you could say the Raiders a little bit, just because in the first week they didn't look anywhere near where they were in week 2. So they were able to jump on the Raiders early on in week 1. Then in week 2 against the Panthers, they ran all over them as well. At least 131 rushing yards in both of these games for the Chargers, and specifically for J.K. Dobbins, right? So I think that speaks volumes to me right away. 2 comfortable wins already. Focusing on the run very heavily, and it's working. It's one thing to focus on it, right, and say that you want this to be your identity, but for it to work so early on and the way it has already, I think it's great. Now, J.K. Dobbins has had those injury problems, so I'm really hoping that he stays healthy because I really like him. I love the fit with him being in Los Angeles, so if he could stay like this, I think it'll be huge for them as well. They've ran the ball 56 times already between J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards as well, so I think that even more fills me with some confidence that this is really something that they want to be identified with. And these 2 wins have been huge. If you're going to be a good team, beating teams like the Panthers, beating teams like the Chargers very comfortably like this is what good teams do. At the end of the day, they handle their business very comfortably if they are to that level. And I've liked how the Chargers have done that overall. They're not asking Justin Herbert to do too much with some of their wide receivers. Ladd McConkey has had a decent game. Quinn Johnson had a better game in week 2. So limiting those wide receivers and not having to depend on them, I think suits them very well. And their defense is doing good enough, right? As much as we praise the Steelers and their defense doing very good, kind of keeping them in games, I think the Chargers defense as well is complementing their offense with how much they run the ball, how good they are at it, and then just coming up with timely defensive stops as well. I'm still waiting for better opposition. That's why I'm anticipating the Steelers game to be better, but so far so good for the Chargers. I've been impressed with them and dealing with all of the new elements that they've had to so far this year. But they're not number 3. They're not number 3 because I think the Buffalo Bills are and could have been higher on this list, but I kept them at number 3 just because, through the loss of Stephon Diggs, a lot of the defense, also, moving on in free agency or just being injured as well, they've been depleted with injuries. Still, they put on very dominant performances from the offensive standpoint at least, right? They were very good in the run game against the Dolphins, and also you go back to that Arizona Cardinals game, Josh Allen turned the superpowers on, right? He became Superman, was involved in 4 touchdowns for this Bills team, and they mounted a comeback against the Cardinals. And I think arguably, out of all these teams I have on here, the Bills have, based on who they are, their reputation thus far in the league, and their recent success, I put them at number 3 because they are still relatively considered a decent team because they have Josh Allen, right? Having that type of quarterback elevates you above other teams. So I had to keep him at number 3 for this point, and because their defense still, they played great against the Dolphins, but against the Cardinals, it didn't look so hot, right? They arguably could have lost that game. So from that standpoint on, I'm still holding on. A little bit of doubt, I guess you could say, for this team, but still very impressed with what I've seen from them offensively. The idea of staying true to that running game, staying true to that identity from Joe Brady, and, still having Josh Allen make all of these throws, still being effective with Dalton Kincaid, Khalil Shakir, and those guys like that, Keon Coleman as well, James Cook. I like the fact that they stuck to this game plan and are really executing on it. So the Bills, to me, are very impressive from that standpoint. Pretty surprised with them at 2-0. I felt like they could have struggled some more with the pieces that they've lost, but I was wrong. Then at number 2, we have the Minnesota Vikings, right? The Minnesota Vikings having Sam Darnold steal the show over the first 2 weeks. They've been very impressive overall. Again, where this could have been a situation where having Sam Darnold could have been a negative for them, could have potentially held them back. Sam Darnold has been nothing short of exceptional for them, doing everything right, conducting that offense at a very good pace, at a very good level, and they just had a statement win against the San Francisco 49ers, right? That win was enough of a surprise to me to include them in this list and be one of the top 2 teams that I certainly didn't expect to be 2-0, and not only be 2-0, but the way that they got to 2-0, like I said, beating the 49ers and in week 1, taking care of a worse off Giants roster, I think speaks volumes to me. And being led by Sam Darnold. I think that defense also, with the additions of Stephon Gilmore, they've recorded 11 sacks in 2 weeks as well. It's very good. They run the ball very well with Aaron Jones as well, and Ty Chandler looks pretty solid as well. But the biggest thing of all, I think now people are starting to realize that head coach Kevin O'Connell is pulling the strings so perfectly, and he could be included in that conversation with the Kyle Shanahans, the Sean McVays, and all these brilliant play callers, right? Kevin O'Connell hasn't been talked about, I think, as much in that regard. And it's a miracle that they won games last year with 3 different starting quarterbacks. Now that he has a pretty good one in Sam Darnold, I like their chances of going forward. I've been impressed with them so far, but they're not number one. They're not number one because I think this one was a pretty obvious one. The New Orleans Saints, to me, are at a left field type of surprising so far this year because they're 2-0. They've scored 91 points through their first 2 games, touchdowns on their first 15 drives, 15 or 14 drives to start this year is remarkably exceptional, right? I'm throwing all the adjectives out there at them because it's all thanks, I think, in my opinion, to Clint Kubiak as their new offensive coordinator. Just has them looking like a completely different team because they didn't really add much, if anything, at all to this offense. You know, Kamara's still there, Olave's still there, Raheed Shaheed is still there, Derek Carr's still their quarterback, and where in a situation where they could have declined, possibly become very boring and monotone, they increased tremendously. And on the offensive side of the ball, like I said, they look unrecognizable from a year ago. Their passing game is working very well, and not only that, I think it's working off the run game exceptionally well, and that's where you see the next level play calling, right? Because you see the run game working, right? But you're just not throwing in there some random pass plays that you think are going to work. It's all based off of the run and how you deceive opposing defenses, right? Showing them similar looks, similar heavy sets, but running different plays off of that really takes this offense to a whole new level, and I wasn't expecting this at all. Like I said, I knew their defense was pretty solid, but their offense to put up this many points, again, albeit against the Panthers, but to go into Dallas and beat them like they did, I think it sent a message. And now next week they will host the Philadelphia Eagles. That'll be a very good test for them, but the way that they're rolling, I don't think they should be that heavy of underdogs against the Eagles, if at all. I'll be interested to see those lines, but that is the list that I made up. Those are the most surprising 2-0 teams, in my opinion, thus far. But we're going to get to the other side of that, right? 0-2 teams. Which 0-2 teams have been the most worrying to me at this point in the season? I'll give you my top 5 in that regard when we return in just a few seconds.